Growing up Christian, I've always questioned why we did what we did. And usually within the faith of Christianity, you're told not to question, you're told just to believe God. But once I became an adult with my own children, married, going through the same rigmarole, I started to realize that something was amiss. A friend of mine, she called me and she said, LaToya, my family and I have converted to the Hebrew roots of the Christian faith. And I was like, what the hell? She was literally telling me that her family's life had changed, that her children were different, her marriage was different, her finances were different. So when she said that her home life was in fact changing and that she could see the results of that change, I was like, you know what? What do I have to lose?
All right, so today we're talking to LaToya Carter. She's from Tampa, Florida, and she actually has an interesting story because she converted to Judaism in her adult life. We're going to dig into
Yes.
that and also all her background. Thanks for joining us, LaToya.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Hi,
So,
Lonnie.
hey, first of all, your Hebrew name is Yocheved. That's correct.
You'll have it. Yes, you'll have it.
Okay,
Yes.
but your parents named you LaToya, so I assume you're raised in a traditional Christian household. Why don't you talk about a little bit about where you're from, what your youth was like?
Absolutely. Well, the funny thing is, I was raised Christian like most Black Americans in the church. My story is a little different where I was raised in predominantly white churches, which was interesting. I went to an all Black coded private school for a number of years. But when I would go to church and have my friends and my groups and all that kind of stuff, it was in predominantly, white spaces, which was interesting. So my road to Christianity and then Judaism has been forged with a lot of influence from my mother, who felt like she was called to ministry very early on in my life. And so it's everything we did was structured around church and spirituality, and my mother being like the prophet from God himself type of experience.
So were your parents strict Christians then? Did you go to church every Sunday? Was it kind of a strict situation that you were dealing with?
Yes. Yes. I wouldn't call it strict because if that's all you know, it's just all you know, right? So,
Mhm.
but we did. We went to church every Sunday. We did camp meetings when Jimmy Swagger, before Jimmy Swagger was accused of, soliciting prostitutes, all that kind of stuff. We went to the camp meetings, Jimmy Swagger camp meetings, Benny Hinn, you name it. She would drag us to these different camp meetings and then church and Wednesday night church and youth group. And to be honest with you, because my experience was more in a predominantly white environment, the things I was able to do and the way that I actually saw the world was shaped because of the differences and variations in religiosity, I should say, from a black to white perspective.
So when did that start to change for you personally? Like when did you start to have some questions about your faith, and when did you start to maybe gravitate to other schools of thought?
Big question. So I've always been one to question. I think, growing up in Christianity, well, first of all, I think it's a part of my personality. I always question everything, something about authority. But growing up Christian, I've always questioned why we did what we did. And usually within the faith of Christianity, you're told not to question. You're told just to believe God or believe those that were sent, quote unquote, in his name and what they said. And so, a little bit of it was just appeasing. Okay, well, I won't question this, but in the back of my mind. But once I became an adult with my own children, married, going through the same rigmarole, I started to realize that something was amiss. And at some point in time, I said to myself, if this is the best that God has to offer, I might as well go and just worship Satan because this is not for this wasn't for me. It was for the birds.
What doctrines did not jive with you at the time?
Well, honestly, as an adult, married, like I said, married with children, we did everything. We did the tithing. We went to church Monday through Sunday. My kids were in the church's school, private school thing, and yet and still, my life was in shambles. And I couldn't understand if we were following the formula that was passed down as the "Thus saith the Lord." Why was my life not showing the fruits of those things? Because you're taught that in church that God's word goes forth and produces something. And so if you are under his word, listening to his word, following his, quote unquote, precepts and commandments, then it should be producing something. It wasn't producing anything. But then when you looked around at other, I say traditions, way of life, faith, spirituality, the communities looked far different from the ones that we were living in. And so that really started my curiosity.
And then what led you to Judaism? Because it's still a Judeo-Christian, like they're still very much cousins in terms of religious. What drew you to that religion specifically?
Well, honestly, a friend of mine by the name of Kathy Butler, she was kind of like a sister mother to me. And so I remember one day she called me and she said, LaToya, my family and I have converted to the Hebrew roots of the Christian faith. And I was like, what the hell? Hebrew roots of the Christian faith. I was like, what is that? And so she was like, yeah, we observe the Sabbath and the high holy days or the holy days, feast days, and we don't eat pork anymore. And at that very moment, I was actually sauteing some pork chops. So I was like, good luck with that girl. And and so, but she was like she was literally telling me that her family's life had changed, that her children were different, her marriage was different, her finances were different. And as I said before in my story, that my life was in shambles. Not that, my marriage was just horrible, but it's just that we couldn't rob Peter enough to pay Paul, and things were not making sense. And so obviously that caused a strain in the marriage. So when she said that her home life was in fact changing and that she could see the results of that change, I was like, you know what? What do I have to lose? Right now, it ain't working. So we started she said, well, come with me to temple. So we started going to, or I should say, Messianic synagogue, I should say. So we started going to this synagogue on Saturdays. And I am an avid reader, but an avid history buff, as you know. And so going to temple and hearing the history and just the background and the things that I had not known about the same scriptures and or caricatures that we learned about throughout the years, and why certain things were what they were, on top of the fact that these were African people. These were Black people that we were, discussing. And so I would listen to them on Saturday, and then I would turn around and go to church, my same church, on Sunday. And so one day I was listening to the pastor and he was saying some scripture about something. And I realized he didn't know what the heck he was talking about. That the very thing that he was using as a foundation to preach his sermon to those who were listening, it was completely a miss. And so I realized right then and there that I could no longer sit under that, and that I needed to make a change for the betterment of my family.
So you said your family was in kind of your life was in shambles when you kind of realized something was
Yes.
amiss. Did you attribute that to external situations, or was that more of an internal situation that you attributed that to? If that makes
It
sense.
was Yeah, it kind of makes sense. Well, I can definitely tell you that it was more of an internal thing, and internal why? Because being raised and brought up under Christianity, you're basically conditioned that when things are not going right or things are wrong in your life, you take it to God in prayer. And so you spend a lot of time doing that and with the hope genie mentality is what I call it. You just rub on the Bible and hope that God appears and takes everything away, when in actuality it takes you actually seeking help, getting physical, mental, emotional help with the spiritual components in order to work through things. And so having no example of that and not knowing exactly how to, just move in that direction myself, a lot of the issues within my life, now that I reflect back, were internal, right?
Mhm.
Because you realize that you possess everything you need in order to create the environment and the reality that you want, but you're not taught that. You're taught to look externally versus internally.
So then you kind of have this realization that this pastor didn't know what he was talking about. And then you're
Right,
already getting exposed to Hebrew or the Jewish faith. What happens
right.
then?
So, we start the conversion process. So now what's interesting is that there are, in what I consider to be, three sects of Judaism. You have your Orthodox Jews, you have your Reformed, which is where I fall now, but not then, but Reformed Jews, and then you have your Masonic Jews. Which is very interesting. The Masonic Jews I've always had a issue with, from the standpoint that I felt like it was a group that straddled the fence. You're either Christian or you're or you're Hebrew. one or the other. Like, and so Masonic Judaism keeps in my opinion, the financial benefits of Christianity, where you're giving money all the time, and it's kind of like this familiarity to Christianity, but then you have Hebrew principles in regards to how you do feast days, Shabbat, that kind of thing. And then Jesus is still in the picture, from that Masonic perspective. And so my thinking is, okay, well, if Jesus is still in the picture and you're still doing certain things, then you are in fact Jewish. I'm sorry, you're in fact Christian. Excuse me, you're in fact Christian. So what you're doing is you're integrating certain practices within your Christian walk, which are more biblically founded, if I can say that, or Torah founded, that kind of gives you this premise. So what happened was I started to question that. Now, in Hebrewism or Judaism, as people tend to be more comfortable in saying, it's encouraged that you question. It's encouraged that you question, and when you get an answer, you question that, and then when you get an answer, you question that again. So you're always in this perpetual state of chasing or running after wisdom. Which is basically what the Torah talks about, how wisdom eludes you, how you have to chase her, how you have to be in pursuit of her. And so that was one of the things that really drew me, on top of the fact that you start to understand the historical practices by which you say you believe. And then, and for me, I started doing a lot of research and understanding that Christianity is an African religion. Hebrewism or Judaism is an African religion, and so the connectivity, and I started to change my mindset on how I saw spirituality, how I saw Judaism from a tribal perspective, from an African mind versus what we had been sold and given, long ago. And so as I started to do that with my family, I literally started to see the change in my marriage, started to see the change in our finances, started to see the change in my children. Why? Because there are principles that work no matter what faith you belong to. There are certain things that you can do that are going to give you the results that you're looking for, because they are literally just staples in life, like the principle or the law of gravity. Something goes up, it has to come down. It's the same way of practicing or going about your life, which is why we call it a way of life, because it's just a series of things that you do that yield you result.
I have so many questions, but the next one I want to
Yes.
ask is what principles, or you think what laws do you think started having those different results in your family?
Well, the first thing was the practice of Shabbat. So one thing in Hebrewism is everything is about order, you know. And of course, we in Christianity we hear, okay, the husband and the wife and the children and whatever, and God is at the head of that. But in Hebrewism or Judaism, that is in fact an actual practice. When you observe Shabbat, which a lot of times Christians don't realize that when they are discussing the Last Supper, it's the Shabbat, it's the Sabbath, right? And so the blessings that are entwined in why you're doing, from the salt, from the challah bread, from the candles, the white cloth, the head being covered, all of these things, from the talit that is placed over the heads of your children, the blessings that are integrated in the practice of the Shabbat yield literally the results of a more peaceful, fruitful, and productive family, because you're actually integrating through your words these foundational principles that have worked from the beginning of mankind. And so that was one of the beginnings. And then we followed it up with our feast days. We followed it up with our giving. So for instance, in Christianity, you're taught to give 10%, right? And so you take your tithe, 10% of your wages, and you put it in the envelope at church, and you put it in the basket, and you hope that that money is going to whatever. But when you actually do your research, you realize that the 10%, or the tithe, as they like to call it, that 10% was actually meant for the widows and the orphans. It was meant for you to take those resources and to make good within the community. And so during Shabbat as a family, what we would do was we would bring our 10% together and we would adopt an orphanage. Or we would, how do you adopt the orphanage? You go to the orphanage, you ask them, what are some of the things that you need? You use that money to purchase those things, and then you give it to that orphanage, or you give it to that convalescent home or whatever, because that's what it's for. And so through that, you are actually satisfying a principle and a life rule, in my opinion. And so those things, the universe has a way, because the universe, I personally believe, that the universe is trying to find, not trying to, the universe has made it its point to make sure that you are well, that you are prosperous, and not necessarily financially, but mentally, emotionally, physically, like and financial, like it's making a earnest effort, a hardcore effort to make sure that you are in a position of win. And the way that you actually help the universe, in my opinion, not that it needs help, but the way that you actually help it is by aligning your principles of how you lead your life with how the universe works. The universe is a soul reap type of cycle. And so when you do that, you are kind of like buying into or working into the system that the universe has set as a way of life. So those are just some of the things that I put into practice.
Gotcha. So my next question, as you were sort of researching or learning more about what's the process called when you become a Hebrew or Jew? What's the process called?
Conversion?
Conversion. Yes. When you're going through the conversion, do you have any thoughts about becoming like a Black Israelite? Because I know there's a sect sort of Hebrew Israelites that are predominantly African American. Do you have any thoughts about venturing that direction?
To be honest with you, I don't know much about them, about that sect. Um, they remind me a little bit of kind of like a Nation of Islam in the sense of how of their aggression and the knowledge
A
and
little militant, right?
yes, very militant, and I don't know much about that. I do find myself sometimes, a lot of times, in a crossroads because one thing about researching of anything is that you find truth, right? And in finding truth through researching, because again, like I said, you question. You find the answer, you question, you dig more and more and more. And a lot of the questions that I ask myself is why are why some of the things that are presently a rule of thumb, why are they that? Why you don't see a lot more Black Hebrews when in fact the foundation of the faith was, embedded within African culture? Why is it that, when you look at the current map of Negro land or the continent of Africa, you can actually see where it says slave coast, the kingdom of Judah? Why is that there? What is the significance for of those things? And how is it that when you look at Deuteronomy and it talks about the people being scattered to the four corners of the earth as a result of their disobedience, why do we fit that? But you have another sect of people taking credit for it. So I had all of these questions. And, as I started to understand, especially in Leviticus, you start to understand genealogy and, how, the descendants of these people and why certain things are the way they are. So I found myself kind of like in the crossroads of the Hebrew Israelites because I understand that the knowledge that they have is what actually fuels and empowers them to do what they do. I just question their tactics because you can't make somebody believe or see you in a way, right, that they choose not to. I think one of the ways, in my personal opinion, that people start to come around is when they see the evidence, when they see the evidence of what it is that you say, of how you live, how you move your life, actually being um kind of like just actually being exposed within your community. So my thought would be, okay, all of these Hebrew Israelites, let me see your home. Let me see the community. What are you doing? To increase, to make it, to make your communities better. What I'm saying? How are the people around you being affected in a positive way? Like those are the things to me. When you see what we consider to be the Jewish community, we can actually see those things. We can actually see the prosperity in the community. We can actually see them being their brother and sister keepers. We can actually see where they have taken up mantles of support and and they don't do much. They don't have to do much to, have a call of action. They just make a call of action and people come. But I also understand too that they don't have a lot to overcome. They don't have much to overcome mentally when it comes to who they are and their identity as well. So yeah, I find myself kind of looking over there like I see you and I understand you, but I just have not been able to venture into that world.
So what was the conversion process like as you decided that you wanted to be Jewish?
So that's very, very interesting. As I said before in the beginning, I so in being a reformed Jew, as people. tend to refer to. There is a process. So this is the funny story. At one point in time, I was going to Temple. I would go to Beit Tehillah in Valrico, Florida, where I live. And at another point, I started to go to Sharia Zedek in Tampa off of Swan. And so Sharia Zedek is what we would call like the rich temple. And like all the doctors, the lawyers, all the people, all the Jewish people that had bread would go to Sharia Zedek. And so after every service, you will have an oneg, which is kind of like what Christians would call it, fellowship. After every service, you would just fellowship in the oneg and whatever. And I remember talking to Rabbi, forgot his name, Bernstein. And Rabbi Bernstein, and I'm gonna call a thing, he was absolute racist. He was absolute bigot. When I would go to him to talk to him about the process of conversion, the authentic process of conversion based on reform Jews, he wouldn't give me the time of day.
Hmm.
He would not give me the time of day. He would not follow up with me. He would not answer any. He would not return any phone calls. He would not give me a time of day. Now there was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Simon that was under Rabbi Bernstein, who was pretty cool. But it was interesting to see the interaction between a black woman and this Jewish community. So I remember Rabbi Simon coming up to me and he says, we don't believe in Jesus, right?" And I was like, "I'm very aware, but it was just the idea, like, so because I'm black, I have to. Your response to me is, so again, I would go to service and I would see where they would have these classes of women that had converted to Judaism, and they were white women. Okay. If it was a black woman in tow, she was with a white man or a Jewish man, so it was more acceptable. So when it came to me doing it the correct way or the reformed way, I was never given the opportunity. So fast forward, I'm at Beit Tehillah, uh no, Beit Shalom in Brandon, not Beit Tehillah, Beit Shalom in Brandon, and they had a gay rabbi who I loved. I was here for it, right? And he had his own challenges in the temple as well. But I remember talking to him about, okay, I need to go ahead and do this conversion the right way or the reformed way. And he told me, he was like, "Oh, it costs about $300 to do the course, to do whatever." Like, you got to be kidding me. And I would have had to do it on my own versus having the guidance of a rabbi. So I said to myself, I said, "You know what, LaToya, one thing is for certain. When you change your way of life, when you do things a certain way, there is no one who can tell you what you are not. On top of the fact that I have the DNA marker to substantiate why I am and who I am and why I do what I do. So I haven't, according to the textbook, I have not converted authentically according to reformed ways and practices. But my lineage says that I can and I have.
Gotcha. So in paper, you haven't paper crossed, in other
I haven't
words.
paper crossed. No, I haven't crossed those burning sands of Judaism from a
Right.
reformed perspective. Yeah.
But every time I speak to you, you're like, you always refer that you're Jewish. I mean, as long as I've known you, you've always said that. So that definitely
Yeah.
is the religion that you ascribe to.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
So I was gonna ask you about the racism. Have you experienced any racism in the process? You said the one rabbi seemed to be a little bit
Absolutely.
particular. Okay. Could you give me
Absolutely.
examples?
Well, I mean, well, that's one, but racism is the never-ending fabric within this society that we live in. And I've always found it fascinating to a degree when it comes to Judaism or Hebrewism, that I would like to call it. But I always found it fascinating because one of the tenets that you are inundated with in the temple is do not forget. Do not forget. Do not forget what happened during the Holocaust. Do not forget what happened during this persecution. Do not forget the stories. Do not forget the heroes. Do not forget those that were lost. Do not forget. And as a Black woman in this country who has a long history of examples of how hate has changed the very flow of how we exist in this society, the total opposite is communicated to us, which is, why can't you forget? Why can't you get past it?
Just
Why
get over
can't you
it.
move on? Yeah,
Hmm.
why can't you move on? Why are you always bringing up old shit? You know what I'm saying? And so when I look at my Jewish brothers and sisters from the standpoint of so it looks like we went through a period, right? It was hard, it was horrible, whatever. We came out of it still, with our foundations, our language, our culture, our presence still intact, right? Here we are in the world. We have a piece of the pie. In 1940, in 1948, or 49, we were given a plot of land, through Britain that was already occupied by other people, but we ain't gonna talk. But we were given a plot of, and this is ours. And so we now have this identity, right? To show our, to validate our existence. But then here in the United States, yes, we walked with King. Yes, we walked side by side because those white supremacists were knocking our heads in between the washer and dryers too, as they were doing with you. Yes, we stood hand in hand in solidarity, but at some point in time, we understood the power of I just had the word assimilation.
Hmm.
We understood the benefits of assimilation as the generations, came down. They understood. Hey, listen, we're not trying to fight like our great grandfathers and whatever. When I can just marry so and so and cut that name not from Goldenstein to just Golden, and I can live a life within my community that is prosperous. So speaking of racism, it's something that is woven. I heard a rabbi, so-called rabbi. I don't consider him to be a rabbi. I don't think other rabbis consider him to be a rabbi, but Rabbi Messer in Denver, Colorado. I remember him speaking to a congregation during Passover, and he referred to Black Americans as coloreds. He spoke about the Sephardic Jews in Spain and the this, that Jews and da 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 and the colors. And I'll never forget hearing that and then wondering why so many people, black folks are still sitting there listening to this nut, just to have that compounded recently from the last election where he brought in a Indian guy to literally prove this case that if Kamala was in fact elected, that she would bring Hindu into the White House, which sounds so familiar to when Barack Obama, oh, if you elect Barack Obama, he's going to bring Sharia law into the White House. So racism is a well living, alive, full fat reality when it comes to Judaism as well as Islam as well as Christianity. It's just what it is.
So how did your family react as you were converting and now that you ascribe to be a Jew?
Um, ooh, initially being my mom was this I believe God called me to ministry type person, and she raised my siblings and I a certain way in our home a certain way. It was very hard for her because in her mind I had lost my way. Not just that, I used to work at the housing authority. I can't tell you the number of times I was told by people who looked like me that I was going to hell for some for some reason or another, and I couldn't understand that. So for my family, it was different. They didn't really. My mother would say certain things, and then I would actually come back with correction, just with actual facts, right? You can never argue feelings, but you can never argue someone's feelings, but facts you can argue. And so I would always come back with facts, historical facts as to why something was done in order to challenge her very belief as to why she was doing it, i.e., Christmas. I.e., the giving, how, whatever, help, Easter, things like that. And so we would have these conversations, and she would just find herself being quiet. So after a while, I think it just really did a job on her to the point where at this point our relationship has just been what it is. We just kind of go our separate ways and we believe what we believe. But for the most part, my family has not given me any heartache. I think it's more people, more so people on the outside when they find out that I'm not what most Black Americans are, that they look at me a little different. And I hear things like, "Oh, I've never met a Black Jew before," and I was like, "Well, I'm the same person you met before you knew."
Mm.
So yeah, that's always been the interesting thing.
So how has your life changed? Has it changed in any other kind of way since you converted?
I would say it's changed a lot. The way that I see everything, in my opinion, has changed. I was just saying this to my significant other yesterday when we were out and about. I was like, you start to see where life is literally engulfed in everything you do, from the air you breathe, the trees you see, the flowers that spring, the grass. You start to understand how everything kind of melodically works together, and you understand that we're all here for a purpose, not just this ceremonial. Yeah, you're here for a purpose. Blah, blah, blah. No, like you're really here for a purpose. And throughout my walk, I've adopted this saying as as a reminder. And that saying is that service is the fee that you pay to live on this earth. So
Mm.
your life and everything that you do in life should be that of service. You should be looking for ways to serve because your bill is always due. And so the idea or the thinking, people always say people who have lived extraordinary lives, when they have expired, then their life meant something. And so the ideal is if you don't have a name to go with your actions, that maybe you didn't live an extraordinary life. But that's not true. Because to someone, you were an amazing person. To someone, you were extraordinary. To someone, you helped them to make it out of that miry clay that they didn't think they would be able to make it out of. So, it's forced me to look at myself from a continuous perspective, and ask that question: how have you been of service today? How have you paid your bill today to qualify and quantify why you're still here?
Mm.
And under our current situation and circumstance and administration and everything, I think a lot of that is being questioned. But I have to say, as a collective, I'm so proud that we have not fallen for the bait and switch when it comes to the emotional hoax that are going on right now as a people, that we're really just kind of sitting back and allowing ourselves to heal and come up with plans on sustainability for ourselves. And so within that is, again, how do we then serve one another? How are we being our brother and sister keepers?
So we are almost out of time. And since this is Seeds of Awakening, I like to ask some common questions to all my guests. I'm kind of going to
Mhm.
modify it for you because it all starts with a question, right? People start to question their faith or how they were brought up. And the same process went through you. So what would you say to someone who's starting to question how they were raised and are starting to have feelings of maybe there's something else out there that I should look into? What would be your advice to them?
Look, do your research, ask the questions, dig down deep, be honest with yourself first, and really, really know why you're doing what you're doing, not from a emotional perspective, but really for wanting to be closest or closer to your inner core, your inner self. More so, and figuring out what faith aligns with that. I had a brother that was Buddhist. I have a brother that's Muslim. I had a brother that's Christian, and so we all come from the same father. But we've all, at some point in time, made our way to choose our own path. So I would say question and keep questioning until you come to a place where you are in your best space.
That is a great answer. LaToya,
Yeah,
where can folks find you if they want to ask you questions or they want to reach out to you?
well, I am the principal and proprietor of Let's Be Clear Communication. So definitely send me an email to LaToya, LATOYAC, as in cat, at Let's Be Clear Communications.com. And I will answer any questions, or just if you want to just chit chat or whatnot, you can definitely send me any inquiries from there. But if you're looking for a PR person, you need some marketing, some branding advice, saying a plug, Definitely reach out to me and take a look at my website, letsbeclearcommunications.com.
Very good. LaToya, I want to thank you so much. You definitely
Thank
shared a
you.
different perspective on this whole awakening conversation, and I appreciate your story.
Thank you very much for having me.